Thanksgiving had always been a subtle battlefield for me, a test of patience and endurance that, until now, I had accepted with a quiet, almost invisible dignity. I had spent decades watching, listening, and accommodating. The same guests, the same polite laughter, the same careful clinking of silverware as if each note were a silent judgment of my worth. This year was supposed to be different, or so I had convinced myself. Perhaps I was dreaming, perhaps just naive. Had begun like any other, the kind of crisp autumn day that seems to hint at comfort and warmth, yet carries a hidden chill. The sunlight poured through the oak trees lining the driveway, golden yet fleeting. I moved through my kitchen with deliberate precision, checking the oven, carving the turkey with steady hands, arranging side dishes with a care born of years of practice. Each cranberry sauce mold, each dollop of mashed potatoes, each carefully folded napkin was a small act of silent love. For my family, for tradition, for the idea of belonging. By noon, the house smelled of roasted turkey, sage, and cinnamon. The table gleamed under the chandelier's soft glow, silverware polished to perfection, plates set with exacting symmetry. I allowed myself a rare moment of pride, imagining the smiles of approval, the quiet acknowledgement that perhaps my work mattered. I imagined laughter spilling from the dining room, gentle teasing, the comfort of shared warmth. I imagined nothing like what would happen next. I had drifted into a light doze at my desk after arranging the last of the side dishes. Exhaustion had claimed me, not surprise, not suspicion. My eyes fluttered open at 6:32 p.m., the digital clock casting a dim, pale light across the room. I had missed the start of dinner. My chest tightened as the reality settled in. The faint murmur of voices, laughter, clinking silverware. My family and their guests were already gathered in the dining room. They had begun without me. I straightened my shirt, smoothed my hair, and descended the stairs, each step deliberate. My feet barely made a sound on the polished hardwood, but with each movement, the celebration below swelled in volume. The sound of voices multiplied, overlapping conversations, subtle notes of wine glasses catching chandelier light, laughter that rang a little too sharp to be innocent. Guests. They had invited guests. In my house. And then I saw them. Through the archway, the dining room spread before me like a theater stage. 10 people, maybe more, seated at a table overflowing with food. Turkey carved in golden, stuffing steaming, cranberry sauce glinting under the warm light, wine glasses catching reflections like miniature chandeliers themselves. The golden bird was half consumed, an island of privilege and satisfaction in the center of a sea of plates. At first, nobody noticed me. I lingered in the doorway, observing, cataloging. Then, Judy Brennan from 3 houses down, dressed in a blue sweater, paused mid-sentence, eyes flickering with surprise. A ripple passed through the table as others followed suit, recognition dawning in hesitant, awkward stages. And there he was, Theodore, my son-in-law, the architect of humiliation. He had been grinning before, but now the grin widened into something more malicious, more deliberate. My daughter sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her expression carefully controlled. Yet the contempt in her eyes pierced me, sharper than any knife, colder than the frost gathering on the window panes outside. "Rosund," I said, my voice calm, measured. I had learned long ago that anger, shouted or uncontrolled, could be used against me. "Why didn't you call me down for dinner?" My daughter's glance flicked to Theodore, then back to me. Contempt, clearly expressed, but under a practiced mask of civility. Theodore pushed back his chair with a scraping sound, approaching me with a deliberate casualness that made my blood simmer beneath the surface. "Oh, sorry, Pops," he drawled, each word deliberately slow, exaggerated, like an actor playing a cruel scene for a private audience. "We totally forgot about you. You know how it is. Out of sight, out of mind." He continued past me into the kitchen. I heard the pantry door open, the sound of rummaging, and then the return. A white plastic bucket in his hands. Not just any bucket, but the one reserved for kitchen scraps, the refuse of meals, discarded and forgotten matter. He extended it toward me like a waiter presenting a covered dish at a Michelin-starred restaurant. Inside were coffee grounds, orange peels, turkey bones stripped clean of their succulent flesh, vegetable peelings, and gravy-soaked paper towels. The odor was subtle at first, almost imperceptible under the artificial warmth of the room, but the suggestion of decay, of waste, was unmistakable. Here you go, Pops," Theodore announced, his voice carrying across the room, ensuring every guest heard the insult. "Your plate." Rosen laughed, not a quiet chuckle of embarrassment, but sharp, delighted, cutting. "Now your food will look just right, freeloader," she added, the word hanging like smoke in the air. Two of the guests gasped softly. Judy Brennan stared down at her plate, as if considering whether to intervene. Across the table, a man, Marcus, one of Theodore's work friends, shifted in his chair, discomfort evident but silent. I took the bucket, not with haste, not with anger, careful, deliberate, like accepting an offering in a ritual I did not consent to but was forced into. I held it for 3 long seconds, letting the smell, the weight, the absurdity of it all settle in the air around us. Coffee grounds, orange peels, greasy napkins, humiliation distilled into a physical form. Then I placed it on the floor near the dining room entrance. Not dropped, not flung, not retaliated against immediately, simply placed. And I looked at my daughter. Anyway, for me to react exactly as I always had, to yell, to cry, to shrink, to apologize for my mere existence, waiting for the familiar compliance, the long years of patience and tolerance that had allowed her and Theodore to play this game unchecked for so long. This time I did not. Unleashed. Aaron. I did not move to retaliate. My mind was already turning, plotting. Not revenge born of anger or violence, but strategy, cunning. The slow, deliberate reclamation of dignity that they had so carelessly stripped away. The guests, silent and awkward, shifted in their seats. Some exchanged uncertain glances. I let the tension stretch, allowing each second to weigh heavier, like thick syrup dripping down a cold window pane. I allowed Theodore to feel the discomfort of expectation unmet, of his performance not producing the anticipated result. This was only the beginning. The humiliation had been public, orchestrated with cruel precision. But justice, when it came, would not be simple. It would not be immediate. It would be precise, calculated, and utterly unexpected. I stepped back from the bucket, back from the theater of shame, and considered the room with cold clarity. For the first time in years, I realized that I could leave, that I could walk away from the scripts written for me by others, from the roles imposed by family and expectation. That evening, with its sharp edges of insult and contempt, had offered me a gift I had not expected. Clarity. I would not let them define me any longer, and in that moment, a quiet, unwavering thought crystallized. What I would do next would make them scream and cry. Justice, served in a way none of them could imagine. The room remained still for a few seconds after I set the bucket down. Silence, thick and heavy, filled the dining room like a tangible presence. The guests shifted in their seats, glancing at one another as if seeking permission to speak, to intervene, to undo what had already been done. But no one moved. The social choreography that Theodore had so confidently orchestrated had faltered, caught off balance by my uncharacteristic composure. I allowed myself a quiet, measured breath. My mind, far from empty, cataloged every face, every gesture, every imperceptible twitch. Theodore's grin, once sharp and predatory, faltered under the weight of expectation denied. My daughter's smile, once confident and poised, trembled faintly at the edges, betraying a flicker of unease she could not fully conceal. The bucket of refuse sat on the floor, grotesque in its ordinary banality. Coffee grounds, orange peels, turkey bones stripped clean, vegetable scraps and greasy paper towels. Each item a physical manifestation of contempt, yet now powerless without my reaction. I watched as Judy Brennan, the neighbor, hesitated with her fork halfway to her mouth. Marcus shifted again, his discomfort visible but constrained by the polite bonds of social etiquette. Xiaomi could feel the subtle energy in the room, a current of tension that had once belonged entirely to Theodore. Now it was mine to manipulate, to bend, to stretch, until it became a tool for the justice I planned. Slowly, I began to move into the dining room, my steps deliberate and unhurried. Each footfall, each subtle creak of the hardwood, demanded attention without needing to assert dominance. Theodore's hand twitched slightly as if he wanted to snatch the bucket back, but he did not. My presence had already unbalanced him. I needed no theatrics, no dramatic gestures. I needed only patience and the careful observation of weakness. I allowed my gaze to rest on my daughter, seated at the head of the table like a queen on a throne. Her hands folded neatly in front of her posture impeccable, yet her eyes betrayed her. Contempt, yes, but fear too. A realization that the ritual of humiliation she had relied upon for years was no longer guaranteed to succeed. "Dinner looks lively," I said softly, my voice calm but deliberate, carrying just enough weight to break the fragile silence. Theodore's jaw tightened imperceptibly. My daughter's smile flickered, the corners of her lips twitching as though the muscle could no longer maintain the performance. I took a slow step forward and paused, letting the tension thicken. I studied each guest carefully. Judy Brennan's expression was a mixture of horror and polite disbelief. Marcus, uncomfortable and fidgeting, had clearly anticipated a different sort of evening. Others at the table were less familiar to me, probably colleagues or friends of Theodore and my daughter, but even they seemed to sense the unusual energy in the room. No one wanted to speak first. I bent slightly to pick up the bucket, not to throw it, not to retaliate, but to inspect it with quiet scrutiny. The smell hit me faintly, sharp and unpleasant, but it did not provoke anger. Instead, it focused me. This was a symbol, and symbols could be dismantled, transformed, or returned in kind if handled with patience and strategy. I straightened and placed the bucket back on the floor, exactly where I had found it, and looked around the room again. My daughter's eyes met mine. She held them, waiting, trying to provoke the response she had counted on for years. I smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, but not in the way she expected. This was not fear, nor compliance. It was calculation. I began to speak, slowly, softly, letting the words carry across the table without raising my voice. "You know, Theodore, it's fascinating how certain habits, when repeated often enough, become invisible. People forget that every act has a consequence, that every performance eventually leaves a mark. Some marks fade, others do not. Thickness, a subtle tightening around the jaw and neck, the way someone physically braces for impact when they sense danger approaching slowly." Continued, letting my words land, letting each one stretch the tension in the room like elastic. I spent decades learning how to accommodate, to observe, to understand the expectations of others. I did not realize until tonight how fragile those expectations could be. Perfection. I could see my daughter shift slightly in her seat. The practiced composure wavered. A bead of sweat appeared at her temple. Not fear exactly, more recognition. Recognition that her methods had limits, that the ritual she had depended upon for so long, the quiet control, the subtle humiliation, the theatrical performances orchestrated by Theodore, was now ineffective. Gmail. Remained silent. The guests watched, wide-eyed, caught in the gravity of the moment without understanding its full context. This was not a scene scripted for them. They were observers in a drama they could not anticipate, unable to intervene. I moved around the table slowly, deliberately, allowing my presence to assert itself without overt action. I could sense the psychological tension building around me, stretching across the room like a taut wire, ready to snap at any provocation. Theodore's hand twitched again, a nervous, involuntary movement. My daughter's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, to apologize, to mitigate, but she said nothing. Patience, I reminded myself. Observation first. Action comes later. I allowed myself to reflect briefly on the years leading to this moment. The countless dinners, the quiet patience, the deference I had shown to my daughter and her husband. Always polite, always restrained, always careful not to disrupt the delicate social equilibrium, even when it was tilted unjustly against me. I had tolerated their theatrics, their cruelty, their small but deliberate humiliations. And now, finally, I had leverage, not through anger, not through impulsive retaliation, but through the quiet, terrifying power of composure and observation. Shane September again, studied Theodore again. His grin had faded into something else entirely, calculation, uncertainty, and a dawning awareness that his carefully constructed performance might fail. He had assumed control, assumed dominance, assumed my compliance, but I had not complied. Not now, not ever. Zion, I turned to the guests, my gaze sweeping across the table, noting subtle reactions, individual vulnerabilities. Every person had a rhythm, a pattern, a weakness. Every glance, every twitch, every pause in speech was a data point. I cataloged each one meticulously, storing them for later use. Judy Brennan, for example, seemed caught between social obligation and moral discomfort. Marcus, awkward and unsure, was a potential ally, or at least a conduit for chaos. Others were more peripheral, but even their reactions mattered. In this room, full of witnesses and participants, perception was everything. Committing, dismissing a faint smile, one that did not betray anger, but rather intelligence, calculation, and quiet amusement. I was not powerless. I had never been powerless. I had simply allowed others to believe that I was compliant, passive, and weak. Tonight, they would learn otherwise. I finally spoke again, my voice low, deliberate, and cutting through the hum of tension like a scalpel. "It's remarkable," I said, looking first at Theodore, then sweeping slowly across the table. "How easily people assume compliance. They forget that patience is not weakness. They forget that silence is not consent. They forget that a reckoning can be quiet, deliberate, and devastating." I let the words hang in the air, letting each syllable settle like dust over the stunned audience. No one spoke. No one moved. Theodore's hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white against the table. My daughter's expression wavered between fear, defiance, and disbelief. I bent slightly to pick up the bucket again, not to strike, not to threaten, but to reinforce the symbol. Slowly, deliberately, I carried it to the center of the room and set it directly before Theodore. His eyes flicked up at me, and for the first time in years I saw uncertainty, a crack in the armor of his confidence. "Consider this," I said softly, my words deliberate, not as a joke, not as an insult, but as a mirror. "Look closely. Observe what has been offered and consider the intentions behind it. Perhaps it is time to reevaluate assumptions and expectations." The silence stretched, thick and almost unbearable, until I stepped back. I allowed the room to breathe, to process, to feel the shift in power dynamics. This was not rage. This was not immediate revenge. This was strategy, observation, patience, and the promise of justice that would arrive in its own time, devastating in its precision and utterly unexpected. I had left them with questions, tension, and unease. And as I moved toward the stairway, giving them the space to reflect, I knew the night was far from over. This was only the beginning. The true reckoning would come later, carefully orchestrated, quietly devastating, and entirely unavoidable. Patience, observation, precision, and most importantly, control. Tonight, I had reclaimed the first fragment of it. When the last of the guests drifted away that night, the house felt suddenly enormous and unbearably quiet, like an empty theater after the curtain fell and the audience had gone home. Plates were cleared, Wine-stained napkins balled and tossed into the sink, the chandelier's light dimmed, and the laughter that had once filled the rooms reduced to a faint echo that clung to the walls. I moved through the house like someone threading a needle, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily, not because I feared breaking something, but because I wanted every detail to remain exactly as it had been. The table, the bucket, the faces that had filled it with meaning for me. The memory of Theodore's grin, the coldness in my daughter's eyes, the hesitant silence of the guests, each crawled under my skin and settled there, warming into resolve. I went to my bedroom and packed a suitcase with mechanical efficiency. No fanfare, no drama, just the simple, deliberate motion of folding shirts, tucking in socks, setting aside a worn sweater I liked for comfort. I packed toiletries, a paperback novel I never finished, a little notebook and pen, the tools of a person who wanted to think while on the move. I left behind 2 framed photographs, one of my younger self with my wife on a porch swing, the other of my daughter as a toddler, hair in uneven pigtails, a gap-toothed grin that had once been the axis of my small, patient world. I did not take the photos because I wanted to punish memory. I left them because I knew I could not carry everything that mattered and still move freely. These duas and zipped it. Something in me felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted its allegiance. For years I had worn a weight of courtesy like an old coat, worn at the elbows, a little dusty, but comfortable because it sheltered me from the storms of discord. Tonight, I folded that coat and left it on the bed. I walked downstairs and passed through the dim living room, where the Christmas decorations were already boxed, half assembled for the coming season. In the kitchen, against the pale tile, the white bucket rested where I had left it, a mute testament that whatever passed for civility in that house had been at best performative. My car sat in the driveway, engine cool and patient. I slid into the driver's seat and studied my reflection in the rearview mirror. Gray hair, lines at the corners of eyes, a mouth that had learned to smile in many directions. I started the engine, not with a surge of triumph, but with the calm necessity of someone who had finally decided to make a change. While dwarf without an aim at first, letting the dark map of streets and storefronts pass beneath the headlights. The town was a scatter of suburban lights and late-night diners, the kind of places that seemed to wait on the margins of other people's lives. I passed a gas station. A woman in a windbreaker checked her phone and laughed softly at something I couldn't see. A dog barked behind a chain-link fence. The clock on the dashboard read 10:17 p.m. The night air smelled like wood smoke and the faint residue of autumn leaves. I found a modest motel on the edge of town, the kind of place that promises anonymity with a neon sign and a chipped ashtray on the porch. I rented a room for the night and paid cash, an old habit of mine when I wanted to be invisible. The room was small but clean, lamplight low, a television flickering static from channels I did not intend to watch. I made tea in the tiny kettle, sat by the window, and watched the motel parking lot empty and then settle into a hush. In the quiet, my thoughts began to unscramble, to stack themselves into patterns. Recognized the architecture of a plan. There were, I realized, multiple kinds of justice. Some were loud, shouts, accusations, the immediate, satisfying clatter of retribution. Those would have been easy, but they were not mine. My brand of justice had always been quiet and methodical. It needed time, leverage, and the inevitability of consequence. Disregard the window cracked, enough to let in a scent of night. I wrote at length in my little notebook, observations, small humiliations cataloged like receipts, details I might otherwise forget, names, dates, the exact words said at the table. Theodore, smirk, theatrical voice, the pantry rummage and the bucket presentation. Rossman, delighted laugh, the word freeloader like a stone aimed for the heart. Judy, gasp and the hesitation of someone polite but unsure. Marcus, the shifting discomfort. The guests' faces were data points in a map I was beginning to draw, not vengeful coordinates but threads I could pull at when the time came. Imposition. The plan took shape like a small mechanical device, each part needing to fit the next with precision. It would be public enough to be humiliating, private enough to avoid harm, and polished with evidence that could not be easily dismissed or rationalized away. I wanted something that would pierce the comfortable armor of entitlement they had constructed, a truth so obvious and inescapable that even polite people could not ignore it. I wanted them to feel the kind of exposure that leaves people clawing at the wallpaper of their lives. MPN-ship. The first step was to ensure that their social capital, the pleasant facade they presented to friends, colleagues, neighbors, would crack. Theodore was proud of his image at work, confident, funny, successful. My daughter fed off his glow. If I could puncture that image with an incontrovertible truth, something about his character or actions that could be documented, others would begin to reevaluate him. If the community started to doubt him, the ground beneath their shared contempt would collapse. Imposition. But there was more than one path. I considered several. I could call those 10 guests and tell them what had really happened. The years of small humiliations. The way they had all been complicit through silence. But that would be too easy, too messy, emotionally complicated, and it relied on people's willingness to believe an old man over their friend. I could post something anonymous on social networks, but social media scars fast and fades faster. Trends devour outrage and move on. I needed a piece of information that was slow burning, that would seep under doors, into lives, and force a reconsideration that wasn't based on a single night's drama, but on a demonstrated pattern. As the night wore on, a different, more refined possibility emerged. Theodore, in his job, had a local reputation. He managed client relationships and prided himself on his appearances at events and meetings. I remembered with crystal clarity one of his boasts, a local charitable auction where he had secured a substantial donation by promising a luxury dinner experience delivered by purported culinary partners. He had reveled in the attention, and the community had applauded his cunning. What if that very reputation could be used against him in a way he would never expect? What if a mirror could be held up, one that reflected the truth, not some exaggerated anecdote? My head, carefully worded and anonymous. Letters to neighbors, an email to the office that handled community events, a discreet inquiry to an old friend of mine who volunteered at the town's charity board. I would not attack with rhetoric. I would provoke with evidence. An old man's steady hand reaches for specifics, receipts, photos, time-stamped messages. If I could produce those linked to Theodore, his image would not merely tarnish, it would peel away. 2. One that fed the social engine more directly. The guests were having dinner in my home, and they were witnesses. If I could ensure that they, Judy, Marcus, the rest, had to confront not only the bucket, but also the truth of what had been done in private, of offhand remarks or comments they might have missed, the discomfort would be visceral. People prefer to sleep beside their assumptions. Once those assumptions are shown to be built on rotten beams, they wake disoriented and exposed. I stayed awake until the motel's hush seemed to press against the walls. At 3 in the morning, I made a call. 2 calls, actually. I spoke to an old friend, a woman named Alice who coordinated a modest neighborhood newsletter and had a reputation for discretion. I told her, in careful, partial fragments, that there were stories she might want to look into about a local figure's behavior, stories connected to a pattern of entitlement and cruelty. I did not name names. I did not demand action. I planted a seed. People who want to preserve an image will often water any question that threatens it. I called an address I had been reluctant to contact, the office of the local community center that organized the charity auctions Theodore liked to brag about. I left a voicemail under a neutral, concerned tone. No accusations, just a hint that someone had been leveraging charitable initiatives for self-promotion, and that the board might wish to double-check the confirmations and partnerships listed under Theodore's name. My voice did not tremble. I described dates, events, small discrepancies in receipts that I had noticed years ago, but had never had the courage to act upon. The phone clicked and returned to its plastic cradle. I felt lighter for having spoken. What was not enough, of course. Seeds alone didn't uproot trees, but I had given certain forces a nudge. They would reach toward these half-truths and pull with their own momentum, as they always do. The neighborhood gossip. Engine loves nothing more than a hint of scandal. Professional boards love to shy from scandal. Friends love to self-preserve. I had set invisible hands into motion. But strategy alone would not create the spectacle I craved. There was something more intimate and precise that I wanted, a confrontation that would arrive not as an accusation, but as a mirror held in front of them by someone they could not dismiss. A mirror so small and perfectly angled that it would catch the light and reveal what had been carefully concealed. That's when I thought of the simplest and cruelest instrument of accountability: truth presented in public, in a way that let each person see themselves reflected in it. I would not broadcast the years of my humiliation in a single fiery post. Instead, I would craft a moment that forced them to look. Letters left where they could not ignore them. Receipts and small documents placed in the hands of the people whose applause they craved. A timeline, quietly presented, that would not shout but would make conversation awkward enough that even the bravest liar would wince. When I finally slept, somewhere after dawn in the motel radio's morning traffic report, I dreamt of a house filled with whispers. In the dream, people turned their palms up, as if expecting to find coins, but instead they found tiny shards of glass, clear, sharp, and reflective. Each shard showed a slice of the truth. When they brought their hands to their mouths to speak, they hesitated because everything reflected back at them was their own face, distorted and exposed. I woke before my alarm with a clench in my chest and the solid, cold focus of a person who knows what they will do, but not yet how. The sun was a pale coin over the horizon. I paid for the room, left the key inside a small envelope at the front desk with no name, and drove back through streets that smelled of fryer grease and bakery ovens preparing for the morning rush. My house sat where I had left it, quiet, whole, the white bucket gone from the floor as if someone had swept it away during the night. Perhaps the maids had cleared it. Perhaps Theodore himself had found it and moved it into the garage, telling a triumphant story as he did so. It didn't matter. The physical artifact was inconsequential beside the plan now forming in me. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a small pot of coffee. I sat at the table, turning the notebook's pages, those pages dense with observations, with the raw material of what I planned to assemble. I made a list of people to contact, of documents to track down, of conversations to spark. I thought of my daughter, and of the expression that had passed across her face when she realized I would not comply. I thought of Theodore, the smugness that had bled from every muscle of his face. I imagined both of them in the days to come, trying to maintain a narrative I would methodically puncture. The turning point was not a single dramatic gesture, but the simple, unglamorous act of leaving. In my departure, there was an implied refusal, an articulate, quiet dissent that announced its own existence without needing applause. When I walked out the door, I had not merely fled humiliation. I had claimed a vantage point from which I could act. I was no longer a participant in their theater. I was, for the first time in a long while, an architect. I spent the day following the plan's scaffolding, phone calls, quiet conversations with neighbors I could trust, a trip to the town hall to request records, an afternoon in the library reading public notices and obituaries, and finding the peculiar satisfaction of watching dates align like stars. Everything I did was precise and calculated, the opposite of the chaos that had been thrust upon me the night before. The more I worked, the more certain I became that the best revenge is not a spark, but a slow-burning clarity that reveals what has always been true. By evening, I had assembled the beginnings of a dossier, photocopies of receipts, a few faded emails, and a careful chronology that placed small dishonesties in clear context. I felt the familiar, crooked pleasure of a craftsman whose tool was truth. It was not crude or cruel. It was inevitable. I did not feel vindictive in the base sense. I felt righteous, and that righteousness gave me strength. That night, as the house settled again into a rhythm that did not include my presence at the table, I lay awake considering timing. If I moved too soon, the effect would be diluted. If I waited too long, the momentum would dissipate. There was a sweet spot in between. Enough time for whispers to grow curious, not yet loud enough to be dismissed as rumor. I would deliver my small shards of glass into the places where they would be handled by people who are wary of scandal. The community board, the charity auction committee, a few neighbors with clear reputations for integrity. I would not ask them to take sides. I would simply invite them to look. Leaving had been the smallest, fiercest act of my life. Packing the suitcase had been the first clean incision. The turning point was now complete, not because I had fled, but because I had used flight as a strategy. People who assume passivity are easily surprised when the passive act of walking away reveals a radical kind of strength. As I finally allowed myself to sleep, I felt less like a victim and more like a careful hand at the back of a clock, turning gears that would, in due time, set the whole mechanism into motion. The coming days would be full of small, quiet detonations, letters opening in hands that trembled slightly, phone calls that began with a neutral tone and ended with scratching questions, polite committees deciding, after prolonged hesitation, that they needed to look into facts. It would be slow, it would be surgical, and when the consequences cascaded, they would arrive with the kind of inevitability that leaves people gasping for a narrative that can no longer be sustained. That was the promise I held. Justice not as spectacle, but as clarity. The turning point had been crossed. The plan was in motion. The rest, as they say, was simply a matter of waiting for the right reflections to catch the light. There is a peculiar clarity that comes when a person stops pleading for recognition and begins engineering it. Once the panic of the initial humiliation faded, my mind moved into a different register, less emotional, more structural. The slop bucket had been the spark that revealed the tinder beneath, a pattern of small cruelties, silent complicity, and the comfortable assumptions of a family and a town that had learned to look away. If I wanted real change, it could not be a single thunderclap of anger. It had to be a sequence of quiet, unavoidable truths arranged so that they could not be denied. Pensions, you spread the notebook on the kitchen table like a map. The pages inside were crowded with observations, exact quotations, times, names, and the small details people forget when they later try to explain away an evening. There were the receipts I'd gathered the following morning, old, yellowing copies of donation confirmations, a few misattributed invoices, the printed emails that suggested promises had been made, but not fulfilled, the photograph from a charity gala where Theodore posed with a smiling sponsor, both hands on a giant mock check. Little things assembled into a pattern, the showmanship of Theodore's generosity, the thin seam of truth beneath his self-congratulatory stories. Trang is a patient instrument, I muttered to myself, pouring another cup of coffee. The mug warmed my hands. My plan needed people who valued caution, whose instinct was to verify rather than to lash out. It needed committees, neutral parties, and the slow-moving gears of civic responsibility. Most of all, it needed a public forum where evidence could be looked at calmly, but where reputations also hung in the balance. The community board meeting was an obvious stage. Theodore loved those gatherings. He thrived on the applause when he spoke, the murmured admiration afterward, the feeling that he belonged to something prestigious. If I could get the board to look at a thin, careful dossier, no name-calling, no invective, just documents and a quietly framed question, then the effect would be devastating in a manner I could control. But first, I needed allies, not converts, not crusaders, only those willing to look and apply basic standards of inquiry. Alice, who edited the neighborhood newsletter, had been my first call in the motel that night. She was cautious by temperament, possessed of a stubborn streak of fairness, and well-connected among the town's community activists. I drove to her small house the next morning and found her watering perennials in her back garden, face shaded with a straw hat, eyes curious as I explained carefully what I had discovered. "You want the board to look into this?" she asked after I had spoken for some time, laying out incidents and showing her photocopies of emails and receipts. Her hands, used to clipping tidy newspaper columns and piloting polite inquiries, moved with deliberate steadiness as she examined each page. "Yes," I said. "I don't want gossip. I want documentation to be examined by people who will not be swayed by a grandson's loud defense or a neighbor's loyalty. I want the truth to be considered where the town values truth, at the board." Alice did not promise. She asked questions, sharp, intelligent ones about dates, possible explanations, the provenance of the records. She suggested I bring everything in a neat packet and request a one-on-one with the board's secretary. "Make the request procedural," she advised. "Ask for a review, don't accuse. People respond defensively when they feel attacked. This has to look like a civic matter, not a vendetta." She was right, as she always was. The formality of procedure would cloak the strategy in legitimacy. I left Alice's garden feeling better than I had since the bucket had been set on my dining room floor. She agreed, privately, to pass a neutral note to a board member she trusted, someone who prided herself on impartiality and who might push for at least a preliminary review. It was not full-throated support, but it was a crack in the dam. Next, I turned to smaller, more intimate tactics. For the humiliation to sting publicly, the people who had witnessed it needed to be forced, gently, to see patterns they had previously ignored. Letters and anonymous notes would be read differently if they came with the air of methodical documentation. I prepared envelopes addressed to a handful of neighbors, Judy among them, containing a single sheet. A timeline of public events connected to Theodore's name, dates, and small annotations in plain language. Nothing sensational, merely a suggestion. You may wish to review this timeline in light of your community involvement. The language was bureaucratic and bland intentionally. The goal was to arouse curiosity, not outrage. Making those envelopes felt strangely intimate, an old man's version of guerrilla warfare. I walked the neighborhoods in daylight, slipping the envelopes through mail slots with a practiced, careful hand. Each slip felt like sliding a mirror into a pocket. The neighbors would later pull out the mirror and see fragments of themselves in its reflection. At the same time, I leaned on institutional levers. I visited the municipal office and requested public records, registrations for charitable events, lists of donors, copies of correspondence that were part of the public file. There, I met with a clerk, youngish, polite, with a predilection for bureaucracy. She fed me photocopies, some mundane, some oddly revealing. An email chain where Theodore had thanked a potential sponsor, promising a matching donation, and then a later poorly worded note where the sponsor expressed confusion about the promised arrangement. Nothing explosive in isolation, but collected, with dates aligned and language compared side by side, the pattern hardened. Pregnancies, and while compiling materials at the library, I found an obituary for a man who had once chaired the charity auctions. In the margins of the clipping, a discreet line I had scribbled years earlier resurfaced. Note: check Theodore's promise in 2018. I had sensed oddities before but lacked the will to pursue them. Now the will had hardened into action. Silenced. I also made a decision about timing and venue. A routine board meeting would not yield maximum effect. Too many agendas, too little attention. Instead, I requested a special review of one of Theodore's recent high-profile projects, an event list that fell under the purview of a small committee with real civic standing. I asked for the meeting to be set for a Thursday evening 3 weeks out. That gave me time, enough to let my discreet notes germinate in the minds of neighbors and committee members, enough to pull together 1 or 2 additional pieces of documentary evidence, and enough to ensure that the social momentum would be present when the committee convened. As the date approached, I became both engineer and puppeteer with a soft touch. The envelopes had already begun to do subtle work. A neighbor called Alice to ask her casually if she had ever noticed anything odd. Judy mentioned, in a neutral voice at the hair salon, that she had received a weird little timeline in the mail. Marcus, the uncomfortable colleague from the table, was suddenly less regular on social media, and when he did appear, his posts were small and guarded. Small things, but each was a thread I had set in motion. Tightened. The most delicate element of the plan involved Theodore himself. I did not want to provoke him into reckless countermeasures. His temperament was too volatile for an open confrontation to succeed. I needed him contained, confident, and publicly on display, because people like to see the showman in his element. So I found a way to ensure his attendance at the meeting without triggering suspicion. There was to be an award that night, the community's Civic Heart Citation, a routine gesture the committee used to recognize volunteers. Theodore had been nominated by several people who admired his public flair. He loved such gestures. I did not nominate him. Instead, I quietly suggested, through Alice and a few others, that the committee keep the award open for discussion. The committee, eager for a celebratory tone in the fall doldrums, decided to add the award to the agenda in the same session where a procedural review would take place. It was a small bureaucratic nudge, celebration and scrutiny in the same room. The juxtaposition was precisely what I wanted. In those 3 weeks, I worked like a financier building a case, not a soldier packing for war. I photocopied emails, organized receipts into a chronological binder, and wrote a short cover letter addressed to the committee chair. My tone was neutral, almost academic. I asked for nothing dramatic, only that they review these documents for clarity and accuracy. The documents themselves made the accusations unnecessary. Like an engineer presenting a structural fault, I let the cracks speak for themselves. When the binder was complete, I made 2 more, leaving one with Alice for safekeeping and dropping another at the municipal records office with a polite note. The third I delivered personally, in the quiet half-hour before dinner, to the committee chair's home. Her house smelled faintly of chicken soup, warm and ordinary. She accepted the binder with a puzzled expression and promised she would look. That promise was the hinge on which everything turned. The night of the meeting arrived with a brittle October wind. Leaves skittered across sidewalks in small, embarrassed flurries. I dressed with the care of a man going to see an old play. Nothing flashy, but precise. I wore the shirt my daughter liked, the one that softened the older angles of my face. I took with me only the binder and a small envelope containing the photocopy of a single email. A short exchange where a sponsor politely disputed the claimed matching donation. I had learned that people who handle reputations responded to a single piece of simple evidence presented without pomp. The municipal hall smelled of polish and committee coffee. Chairs were arranged in a loose semicircle. People gathered, regulars and curious newcomers. I sat near the back, my binder on my lap. Across the room, Theodore sat with an easy smile, the kind that assumes applause is inevitable. He chatted with colleagues, gesturing with the easy swagger of a man who is sure of his grip on the room. My presence barely registered with him. To him, I was the tired old man who had always been there. To me, he was a man in a suit whose future relied on the illusions he'd cultivated. The meeting began with routine matters: park maintenance, the charity calendar, a brief report on parking enforcement. Then the chair turned to me. Someone had placed my request on the agenda under citizen correspondence, a procedural vehicle I had used to get the documents in front of the committee without theatricality. I stood and handed the binder forward as if delivering a set of dry, technical specifications. Gmail. Good evening, I said, voice steady. I'd like to request a review of the documentation related to recent charity events associated with Mr. Theodore R. I've compiled what appears to be a chronology of communications and receipts that may merit careful examination. Inserting the room reacted with a rustle. Theodore's smile tightened. He rose, smooth and quick. I'd be happy to field any questions, he offered, pleasant as a television host. He had prepared for the possibility of a small digression. He had not prepared for a dossier. The committee chair, Mrs. Hargreaves, looked through the binder with professional disinterest. Her eyebrows rose only once, and I could see the moment recognition shifted to concern. The committee members began to ask procedural questions about the provenance of the documents, source, dates, whether originals were available. I answered plainly. Public records, emails I printed and cross-referenced, and receipts obtained from municipal filings. I'd be pleased to leave copies for your review. Theodore's hands, ordinarily so controlled and theatrical, had begun to display a human tremor. He insisted that everything was in order. Of course it was. His public persona thrived on the assumption of order, but his words smoothed over a fissure. The chair asked for a pause to examine the documents more carefully and proposed a brief break to confer privately. That was the moment I had orchestrated, the public glow of honor and the private glance of inquiry. Outside in the hall, voices were low and clipped. Theodore spoke with acquaintances, but I heard unease tucked in his laughter. Inside the meeting room, Mrs. Hargreaves excused the committee for a moment and asked to review a document labeled 2019 Sponsorship Correspondence. She scanned the page, then the next. The color in her face shifted subtly, disquiet replacing the polite neutrality she'd worn moments before. When the meeting resumed, a different rhythm governed the room. The committee asked Theodore a string of detailed questions, dates, promises, whether specific donations had been fulfilled. He answered, but each answer was a bead on a fraying cord. Someone asked about a matching donation he had announced publicly in the local paper. Theodore's response was awkward. He could not present a clear confirmation from the sponsor. He spoke of emails, of assurances, of intent. Melancholy crept into his voice like a leak. My plan did not require a dramatic confession. It only required the architecture of doubt to spread. Committee members folded their hands, their faces shaded with the careful concern of people who respected process. The audience in the back stirred. Conversations before the break, about new benches in the park or the holiday bazaar, had given way to a still, expectant hush. When the chair asked for a motion, someone, perhaps encouraged by Alice's earlier nudge, proposed that the committee form a subcommittee to verify the accuracy of sponsorship claims and ensure that donor agreements reflected public announcements. The motion passed, not with a sense of spectacle, but with the matter-of-fact weight of procedural action. By the end of the evening, the committee had scheduled a formal review, with a request that Theodore provide confirmations from the listed sponsors and copies of canceled checks or bank transfers. An accusation written in headlines. It was a procedural inquiry, the sort of dry operation that often leads to reputational erosion, regardless of its final finding. A formal review by the committee would place a spotlight on Theodore's activities. He could respond and clear his name, but the advance of doubt had attached itself like a burr, and social curiosity would do the rest. Ensigns, as people left, neighborhood faces I recognized passed by, some offering cautious nods, others avoiding eye contact. Judy brushed by me, hand briefly grazing my arm, and in that touch, I felt the subtle shift. She had received the envelope, she had glanced at the timeline, and something had changed inside her. Back home, the house seemed smaller somehow, as if the rooms had become rooms where consequences could happen, not just places for polite conversation. The bucket from the Thanksgiving table no longer mattered. It was a symbol. I had replaced it with something else. A series of procedural truths that moved through institutions and the networks people trusted. My approach was not dramatic. It was enduring. Reputation, after all, depends on the confidence others have that your story is true. Once you unsettle that confidence, you have leverage. As I lay in bed that night, watching the ceiling fan turn with the steady, indifferent precision of a clock, I thought of all the little instruments I had used: paper, stamps, moments of discretion. They felt fragile and also inexorable, like frost forming on a window pane. The committee's review was scheduled for 2 weeks hence. In that time, the machinery I had set in motion would produce its own noise. Phone calls, small consultations, the scratch of pens as people compared notes. Symmetry. I did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in cruelty. Instead, there was a cool, moral pleasure in the quiet mechanics of accountability. I had engineered a situation in which truth would be assessed, where truth mattered to those who had admired Theodore. It would be an ironic and, I hoped, instructive humiliation. Not a spectacle of gore or revenge, but a slow, inexorable unmasking, one that would ask them all to reconsider what they had believed and why. Shimmer. The most delicate part of any plan is what you do while waiting. Waiting is where plans die or thrive. I continued to prepare, to collect, to speak quietly with people who might need reassurance that my motives were not malicious. I supplied photocopies where asked. I answered follow-up questions with the honest brevity of a man who had done his work carefully. I resisted the urge to gloat. I let doubt do its work. People are not fond of losing the stage they have built for themselves. And yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, there was that human hankering for something more immediate, a small, delicious thought that they might finally feel the sting that had been delivered to me with the bucket. I let myself imagine Theodore's face when the committee's review found discrepancies. I let myself imagine my daughter's look when friends whispered and asked questions she could no longer easily deflect. But I kept those imaginings quiet, because plans built on anticipation are brittle things. Instead, I read and reread the documents, tightened margins, corrected typos, and made photocopies for safekeeping. I organized names and dates into a simple spreadsheet. The work was ordinary, almost domestic. It felt like being at a drafting table, and there was comfort in the regularity of the motions. Tightened. By the time the 2 weeks were nearly spent, the town's small gossip circuits had begun to murmur. It was not malicious chatter. No one had shouted accusations in the street, but polite people were suddenly more careful with their praise. Theodore noticed the small shift. He had complained to friends about the weird little review that would blow over. He remained defiant in public, exact as always in his charm. But public charm is a thin varnish, and the committee's vote to review had removed more than a coat of polish. It had exposed the raw wood beneath. Teeth. The plan, in other words, had succeeded in its first phase. It had converted witness into curiosity, curiosity into procedure, and procedure into potential consequence. What remained was the second phase, where evidence would be confronted with the person at the center of the glow. That required patience and careful staging. I would not rush it. I would allow the committee to do what it naturally did, ask questions, request confirmations, and summon the ordinary power of civic scrutiny. When I turned off the light that night, I felt oddly calm. The role I had once performed, the accommodating father, the fixture at the end of the table, had been surrendered to a different identity, preparer of small, deliberate engineering, a man capable of turning quiet truth into civic pressure. The bucket of slop had been an insult. My response had been an array of small, precise instruments set to amplify an ordinary thing. Evidence. The plan was in motion. The first gears had engaged, and when the next pieces moved into place, the consequences would not be theatrical, but unstoppable. Facts, applied in plain daylight to a man who had depended on the shadow for his advantage. The rest, as always, would be about the human responses: panic, justification, rationalization, and perhaps the faint, belated glimmer of contrition. The days following the committee's submission passed with a quiet tension that hung over the house like a fog. Theodore went about his routine with his usual charm, laughing at minor jokes, chatting with colleagues, and boasting in a way that had once made me ache with silent frustration. But now, there was a crack beneath the veneer. I watched it spread subtly, in small gestures. A pause before he spoke, a twitch of a smile that didn't reach his eyes, an unusual hesitation when answering mundane questions. My daughter maintained her polite composure, but even she could not fully conceal the unease in her gaze when she glanced my way. The neighborhood seemed to sense the faint tremor too. The envelopes I had slipped into mailboxes weeks before had done their work quietly. Conversations that would have been carefree and gossipy now carried a subtle edge. Neighbors exchanged glances, murmured questions, and slight shifts in tone. The seeds had been planted, and curiosity had begun to germinate. I stayed in the background, a quiet observer. I no longer needed to confront Theodore directly. The evidence, procedural reviews, and social curiosity would do the work for me. Each day, I cataloged small signs of change: calls from neighbors, cautious inquiries from acquaintances, minor adjustments in Theodore's tone and public demeanor. I recorded these details in my notebook, not out of obsession, but to witness the gradual unfolding of cause and effect. Sheffield. Then came the call from the committee chair. She asked me to attend a follow-up meeting, just a short session to clarify certain dates and details. It was procedural, unremarkable, yet I felt the faint thrill of anticipation. This was where my careful orchestration would begin to manifest in tangible consequences. Perplex, reviewing all documentation, organizing emails, receipts, and notes in order. I anticipated questions, rehearsed neutral, factual answers, and ensured I was composed. By the time I arrived at the municipal hall, Theodore was already there, surrounded by his usual entourage of colleagues and friends. His confident smile faltered when he noticed me. The meeting began with ordinary pleasantries, but the air was charged with subtle tension. The committee asked for specific clarifications, and as I answered, I observed Theodore's attempts to interject explanations, charm, and reassurances. His confidence slipped imperceptibly with each precise answer I provided. The committee's attention was focused, professional, and unwavering. By the end of the session, the review had been scheduled formally, and Theodore had no choice but to cooperate. The social equilibrium had shifted, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. I left the hall with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the careful, patient ripples I had set into motion were beginning to converge. Back home, I poured a cup of tea and reflected on the slow but certain progression of my plan. Humiliation, I realized, does not always arrive in a single dramatic act. Sometimes it emerges quietly, in the unraveling of confidence, reputation, and the careful recalibration of social standing. The bucket of slop had been the spark, but these subtle ripples, the patient alignment of truth, procedure, and observation, were the current that would carry the real impact. I sat by the window that evening, watching the town settle under the golden light of dusk, feeling a calm certainty. The plan was working. The next phase would require patience, timing, and subtle precision. But the first wave had passed, and the consequences were already beginning to take shape. The morning of the review arrived like a small, unavoidable storm. Clear, ordinary sky, but charged with an atmosphere that made conversation thin and careful. I dressed without drama, the way one dresses to testify. Neat, unremarkable, credible. The binder sat on my passenger seat like a small, honest corpse. Documents, emails, receipts, each item a witness. When I walked into the municipal hall, the room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Chairs were arranged. Faces were set in polite expectation. They called the meeting to order with procedural language that felt absurdly calm for what it was about to do. Theodore sat where he always sat, in the conspicuous arc of light that public men learn to occupy. He smiled at acquaintances, offered the standard friendly handshakes, and kept his manner so practiced it became a kind of armor. My daughter hovered at the edge of the room, polite in a way that now looked fragile, like paper held over a candle. The committee began by reviewing my packet, point by point. The chair read a few excerpts aloud. An email from a supposed sponsor asking for confirmation, a scanned receipt that didn't match the claimed date, a politely worded public statement that promised a match, and a later note of confusion. The documents lined up like bones in an archaeological display, scattered fragments arranged until their shape suggested more than coincidence. Theodore stood to answer, words polished and swift, but the committee's questions were precise, technical. Dates, bank confirmations, signed acknowledgments. He fumbled for specifics. He produced his usual charm and then, critically, No corroborating documentation. A sponsor's name he had touted could not produce a cancellation or a check. A promised transfer had no traceable imprint in the municipal records. The careful architecture of his public generosity showed seams when probed by the blunt instrument of paperwork. And then, in a moment I had not fully orchestrated but had quietly hoped for, a voice from the back of the room rose. A representative from the charity's finance team, summoned by an anonymous request I had set in motion. She held a single printed email, eyes steady. "We have records," she said plainly. "We have no matching transfer logged under the date Mr. R. announced. We have inquiries from sponsors who say they were surprised by the press release." She laid the paper on the committee table. It landed like a small, decisive blow. Theodore's face, which had been almost smug in its expectation of applause, tightened. His mouth worked. He reached for a practiced joke and found it snagging on the facts. Around the table, heads turned. Neighbors exchanged glances, curiosity sharpening into concern. My daughter's hand found her husband's wrist and squeezed, an instinctive motion that would not stop the tide. "What we are asking," the chair said, voice steady, "is for clarity and for any corroborating documentation. If Mr. R. has confirmations, we invite him to present them. Otherwise, the committee will need to proceed on the basis of the documents before us." He had nothing to hand them that satisfied the scrutiny. Words are light. Documentation is gravity. As the committee voted to escalate the review and request formal confirmations from banks and sponsors, a hush settled over the room that was heavier than the initial laughter had been. The action was procedural, thin on melodrama, but the social consequences were immediate. People in the room shifted. Those who had once smiled at Theodore now looked at him as if considering a different currency: reliability. Outside, in the hall, murmurs swelled like rain. Someone's voice rose, then broke into a sharp exhale, an audible intake of disbelief. A woman in a blue sweater, Judy, covered her mouth with her hand. A man near her, Marcus, staggered backward as if the facts had landed physically. "I can't believe it," he said, too loud. A ripple of noise, a small, involuntary human reaction. Surprise curdled into anger and sorrow. In one corner, a woman began to cry quietly. Grief, not for the documents, but for the loss of an easy narrative where everyone could be comfortably admired. Soon others followed, soft, uneven sobs, then a collective, shocked murmuring that gathered into rising voices. Someone's chair scraped loudly. The sound snapped everyone's attention back into the room. My daughter's face crumpled then, not with anger at me, but with a dawning terror she could not disguise. "This can't be," she began, voice cracking. Theodore's eyes darted. He opened his mouth, gestured, tried to spin explanations that required trust. Trust was a fragile ledger that had just been balanced against the cold ink of records, and it did not add up. The committee recommended a formal audit and communicated that the matter would be discussed with the broader board and, if necessary, with sponsors directly. It was bureaucratic, slow, but this was precisely the point: slow, public, and procedural. The town's social machine moved in inches, but it left tracks for everyone to read. The gossip that had been soft and private would now have the sanction of process. The atmosphere felt altered, less friendly, more cautious. I overheard snippets. "We trusted him," someone said. "How could he?" Another voice: "This is a mess. I feel sick." A woman near the exit sobbed openly, shoulders shaking. People who had attended the dinner that night looked at one another now with new knowledge, as if peering from a boat at rocks beneath the surface they had once ignored. At home, the phone would not stop. Neighbors called to express confusion, shame, or to ask me if I was sure. A few offered quiet support, more offered stunned silence. Word traveled quickly, and the tide of public opinion, which had once flowed in Theodore's favor, began to slacken. His colleagues at work pulled back. Invitations no longer came so readily. The easy laughter that used to surround him thinned into tentative pleasantries. The committee's request for documentation hung over his head like a pending verdict. My daughter came to our living room that night and sat without speaking. For a long time we watched the television, until the trivial images on the screen became petty and irrelevant. She finally turned to me, eyes red-rimmed. "Dad," she whispered, voice small. "I didn't know." Her admission was not an apology. It was the quiet recognition of how little she had looked. It landed more heavily than reproach. "We're in trouble," she said, and the words were not only about reputation. I said nothing inflammatory. I offered no triumph. That was not why I had done it. Instead, I offered a simple, steady hand. "I wanted the truth," I said. "I wanted a place where the facts could be looked at. People will prejudge, and there will be pain. There will also be clarity." She reached for my hand and, after a tension-laden pause, took it. Her fingers were trembling. We did not speak long. The silence was enough. It held both the fear and the fragile, newly forming possibility of accountability. Over the next days, the town rearranged itself around the rumor with an awkward, inevitable logic. Invitations were rescinded, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and friends who once nodded at Theodore's jokes no longer sought his company. The committee's inquiries broadened. Sponsors were contacted, bank statements were requested. Theodore's voice, once the confident center of many rooms, began to sound thin when recorded in polite minutes and emails. Just as I had envisioned it, was not a single scream or an immediate ruin. It was the gradual, procedural unmasking that forced people to reckon with the truth in daylight. The bucket on my dining room floor had been a crude announcement. The work that followed had been careful and cold and, in its own way, merciful. An opportunity for acknowledgement, correction, or explanation supported by facts. Some would scream, some would weep, and some would pretend nothing had changed. When the first sponsor finally responded with a terse, factual email, one that failed to corroborate Theodore's claim, the small world he had curated began to crumble with a slow, human sound. The rearrangement of chairs, the clearing of a table, an audible exhale of disappointment. People who had once cheered now had to pivot, to reevaluate, to absorb the evidence that had been set before them. And in that sound, between the cries, the shocked silences, the practical minutes of committees, I felt the clean satisfaction of an old man who had learned how to make truth do the heavy lifting. Justice, I realized, was less spectacle than structure. It arrived as verification, as procedure, and finally, as consequence. When the dust settled, the town felt like a place that had been lightly rearranged. The same houses, the same trees, but with different lines of sight. People who had once smiled easily at Theodore's jokes now hesitated, searching for footing in conversations that used to be effortless. Invitations that had been automatic were reconsidered. The committee's formal audit produced its own tempo. Polite requests, copied emails, the slow arithmetic of bank records. There were explanations offered, some plausible and some thin. There were apologies too, some genuine, some awkward, and some wrapped in the language of damage control. Life, in its ordinary persistence, kept moving forward, but it moved forward on a different axis. Disregard, the most complicated consequence, unsurprisingly, belonged to my daughter. She had been the axis of my world for years, and her betrayal had been the sharpest cut. In the weeks after the audit, she appeared diminished in a way that had nothing to do with public humiliation. She had to reckon with what she had accepted as normal, and with the ways she had allowed my silence to become an alibi for others. One evening she sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded around a cup of tea, eyes rimmed red but clearer than they had been in months. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said simply. There was no elaborate excuse, no rehearsed defense, only the brittle honesty of someone finally looking at what she had looked away from. The admission was small, human, and far weightier than any grand rhetoric. We talked in pieces at first, halting, careful, and then with increasing openness. She asked questions about the small humiliations I had kept secret. The dinners left cold, the comments softened into jokes, the nights I pretended not to notice. I answered with the truth, and the truth, once spoken, altered the shape of our conversations going forward. Shoreline. She did not become a different person overnight. Regret is not a magic lamp, but she began to show up differently. She sat with me at church more often. She asked my advice about small things she used to take for granted. She visited without the pretense of business to attend to. There were apologies, awkward and real, and there were gestures of restitution that mattered less for their public value than for their private sincerity. A repaired fence, a basket of the brand of oranges I liked, a quiet invitation to lunch. Those small acts mattered. They were stitches, patient and imperfect, sewing the frayed edges of a relationship that had been stretched thin. As for Theodore, the consequences were practical and precise. A few sponsors requested clarifications. A client withdrew a lucrative engagement pending internal review. His professional shine faded in places where it had been most relied upon. He tried for a while to hold the old posture, jokes, rapid explanations, the practiced lightness. But the world that had applauded him now demanded receipts, and receipts are poor companions to theatrical ease. He began to retreat from the stage he had loved. Fewer committee appearances, declined invitations, less public boasting. I did not rejoice in his discomfort. My satisfaction was quieter, a steady sense that the balance had been somewhat corrected. The neighborhood's reaction was varied and instructive. Some defended him fiercely, refusing to reconcile facts with affection. Others, who had simply wanted to believe the best, found themselves awkwardly rearranging their memories. The most interesting responses were neither applause nor denunciation, but the ordinary renegotiations of social life. Who invited whom into their gardens? Who showed up at bake sales? Whose names were read aloud at meetings? Reputation, I learned again, is both fragile and oddly resilient. It bends and sometimes breaks, but people adapt, forgive, and forget in odd combinations. For my part, the outcome had less to do with watching them suffer and more to do with the peculiar quiet joy of being able to stand in my own life without having to perform acquiescence. The suitcase I had packed on that first night remained tucked in the attic for a while, an emblem rather than a tool. I kept the photographs I had left behind. I repaired the porch step my granddaughter once fell from and fixed the loose hinge on a cabinet my daughter had complained about when she was a child. These were small, grounding acts, proof that life goes on and that dignity, once reclaimed, shows itself in ordinary stewardship. People sometimes asked me, with awkward curiosity, whether I felt vindicated. Vindication is a word that suggests triumph. What I felt was quieter, an easing, like uncramping an old muscle. I felt steadier in my own skin. I felt permitted to speak when I needed to speak and to leave when I needed to leave. That permission, once granted, was itself a kind of freedom. The months that followed, Thanksgiving came and went, the house filled with family on one occasion and with friends on another. I cooked when I wanted and declined when I did not. Theodore was invited to one gathering. He came briefly, polite and taciturn, then left early. My daughter and I had our own small ritual now. A walk after dinner, coffee at a late hour, a magazine shared between us. We rebuilt, not on pretenses, but on a softer, more honest foundation. The final image I carry is modest and private. One late afternoon, when the light slanted gold across the kitchen table, I opened the notebook I had used to plan and catalog. On the last page I wrote nothing grand, only a single line. Truth is slow but faithful. I closed the book, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window watching a neighborhood that had been altered, not destroyed, go about its days. The world outside was full of small reconciliations, mended fences, returned invitations, a borrowed lawnmower shared across driveways. Life is not a verdict. It is a series of choices made every morning, emphasized, and justice, in its patient, procedural way, had been done. It came not as a public spectacle, but as a set of consequences that forced people to look, to answer, and in some cases, to change. I slept easier after that. I spoke more freely, and when once in a while someone who had been at that original dinner asked me quietly what had driven me, I answered without rancor. I wanted to see my life respected. They usually nodded, embarrassed a little, and then changed the subject. That was all right. Respect, once regained, does not need an audience. It simply is.